Welcome back. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 5. We've already started the chapter. We're actually going to pick up with it in verse 17. So 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 17. And so we're going to find out David has finally moved into Jerusalem. He's been crowned king of all Israel. So he had the path to kingship as the first segment of his life. Then he was king of Judah for 7.5 years as the second segment of his life. And now he's king of Israel as the third and final segment of his life. And this will be the bulk of what we will deal with in the life of David. That we won't have quite so many intimate details because he reigns for 40 years grand total. We're not really told what happened for a good portion of that time, but we have some really good insights into some things that did happen during his lifetime. David's going to make some mistakes. He's going to have to pay for those mistakes, and those are going to cost him something. He doesn't pay for the mistakes, but it will cost him something in the back end of those mistakes that he makes. And one of the things that happens is fairly soon after he is crowned king of all Israel, he gets into a battle already. So there's actually first and second foreign conflicts pretty close back to back. Right as he's crowned king of Israel. So let's look at verse 17. When the Philistines heard that they had anointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines came up to seek David, and David heard of it and went down to the hold. The Philistines also came and spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to the Philistines?" And as long as David continues the pattern of going to God for direction and what he ought to do, he does well. Wilt thou deliver them into mine hand? And the Lord said to David, Go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into thine hand. And David came to Baal-perazim, and David smote them there, and said, the Lord hath broken forth upon mine enemies before me, as the breach of waters. Therefore he called the name of that place Baal-perazim. Baal-perazim means Lord of the breaks, or where you could say the place where the Lord broke his enemies. Lord of the breaks, Baal-perazim. Now, you'll notice, actually, you probably have noticed before now, the name Baal appears in a lot of things, a lot of names. I know Mephibosheth has a name that was Baal something. A couple of the sons of Saul did. And as Baal worship becomes, Baal as in the false god, becomes more prevalent, some of these are given alternate names so as not to be confused with idolatry in the worship of the false god Baal, made most famous, I think, in the story of Ahab and Queen Jezebel later on in Israel. But Baal just means Lord. That's all the word means. This is not them honoring a false god. I did want to make that clear because we do see the term Baal pop up from time to time, and this is just simply as we be termed lowercase l, Lord. That's all it means. There's no dedication to the false god. Anyway, I wanted to make that quite clear. But the battle of Baal-perazim, the Philistines come to challenge David as the new king and to set up base camp in the valley of Rephaim. And David asks God, hey, should I go after the Philistine army? And God promises victory. By the way, we are also promised victory. We're going to have to walk through some things in the course of getting to victory, but God has promised us victory as well. In our own lives and in our own situations. And we can take him at his word that even though we may not feel victorious at times, and even though we may feel like we're not sure why God has led us in this path or down this direction, we know that God will ultimately get the victory in our life and for his own name's sake, which he is honored and worthy of having. David won a great victory that day. He burns all the false gods that the Philistine army leaves behind. And you'll find that amongst many revivals in Israel's history that happens, they rout all the high places. They cut down the groves. They get rid of the false idols. And so as not to be tempted back into idolatry, which was a big deal in the Old Testament. And time and again, Israel is carried away by her idolatry from the worship of Jehovah, her God. Verse 22 then, so we have the battle of Baal-perazim. God grants great victory. And then in verse 22, we have the battle of Geba. And the Philistines, who evidently hadn't learned their lesson, again, set up base camp in the valley of Rephaim. I think there's just something about this David character. He once seemed to be an ally. He once seemed to be somebody that we could control, manipulate for our own uses and purposes, and use his strength and use his influence. And now it's clear that is not the case. He runs from the king of Gath. He ends up, they see time and again, he's over in the Philistine area. And it is something that plays into his history. And now these people see him crowned king of Israel, and I think they still want to control him or kill him. And so they go after a second time. Verse 22 in chapter 5 says, and the Philistines came up yet again, spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, thou shalt not go up, but fetch a compass behind them, and come upon them over against the mulberry trees. And let it be, when thou hearest the sound of it going in the tops of the mulberry trees, then thou shalt bestir thyself, for then shall the Lord go out before thee, and smite the host of the Philistines. And David did so, as the Lord had commanded him, and smote the Philistines from Geba until thou come up to Gazer. So God gives David special instructions. He said, this time don't go, in full front combat against the Philistine army. This time I want you to go around to the mulberry trees and hang out in there. I'm going to do something for you. I sort of think this is a way that God says, I'm fighting for you. And not only does he say it to David, but he says it, he makes it abundantly clear, even in the land of the heathens, that God is fighting for Israel. David sneaks around behind them, and he chased them to a grove of mulberry trees, and likely this was a larger army this time. It says as a host in this particular battle, and God says, I'm going to take care of this for you. There's a sound of metal that would sound on the tops of the mulberry trees, and this was the signal to attack the enemy. Now, what was the sound of metal? It was something directly provided by God, and it probably was very horrifying for those who didn't know it was coming to hear. It would have unnerved the enemy, and God fights for Israel, and they chase them all the way from Geba to Gazer. So David, excited about the two victories that God has given to him, does something without consulting God first, and because of it, somebody dies. So let's take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 6, and we see that again David gathered together all his chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baalah of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, that dwelleth between the cherubims. So he selects 30,000 men to bring up the ark. And I'm not going to go through all of exactly what happens here by just reading the text, but contrary to God's instructions of how the ark was supposed to be born, David attempts to honor the symbol of the presence of God with his own ideas. Now, he didn't think it through, and he said, okay, I'm going to honor God in my way. And you can't. Cain made the same mistake. I'll sacrifice to God how I say. And while I don't think David necessarily had a belligerent or rebellious attitude, I think he just didn't consider that what he was doing was against God's instructions. So he makes a brand new cart just for this event. It's pulled by oxen. He has instruments play in a grand parade before the ark. And the cart begins to rock, and the ark begins to fall off the cart. And a man named Uzzah goes to stabilize the ark with his hands. But God says, you cannot touch my holy thing. It'll cost you your life. And so God struck him dead. Now, the ark didn't fall off, but it cost a man his life. And David's upset with God now and asks how the ark should be brought up. And while he's waiting for God to answer, he stores the ark in the house of a man named Obed-Edom. Now, this man is going to be significant, not he himself necessarily, but his family is going to become significant in the life of David as he begins setting up the worship system in his tabernacle. Let's actually finish this section here first, and then we'll talk about that when we talk about David setting up the tabernacle. So he moves the Ark of God to the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months, and the Ark is stored there. During that time, God blesses the house of Obed-Edom because the ark is stored there. Now look at verse 13 of chapter 6. Verse 13, and it was so that when they bare the ark of God, the Lord had gone they that bear the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces. He sacrificed oxen and fatlings. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of David brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. So now it's being carried the way God said to do it. God said, it's carried on staves by my priests. And so now David's doing it the way God said. And he starts dancing before the Lord, and he moves the ark of God into his capital city, Jerusalem. Well, Michal, Saul's daughter, his first wife, the one he had to go to Phaltiel and take back, thought David was making a foolish spectacle of himself. And really, the Bible says she despised him in her heart, looked down on him. For how he was praising the Lord. We need to be very careful. There are some people who are praising God sitting in church. And there are some people praising God with an uplifted hand, or with a clap, or with their mouth. Amen. Or praise the Lord. Hallelujah. They might be more exuberant. Some of us could use a little more exuberance. But Michal looked down on how David was praising God. And God didn't like that. He didn't like it one bit. Look at, let's finish the story first. David blesses the people, gives them all a meal. David wants to return home and bless his household. And let's look at verse 20. There's an interesting story here. David returned to bless his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said how glorious was the king of Israel today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovereth himself. And David said unto Michal, it was before the Lord, which chose me before thy father, and before all his house, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord over Israel. Therefore will I play before the Lord, and I will yet be more vile than thus, and will be base in mine own sight, and of the maidservants which thou hast spoken of them shall I have be an honor. Therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death. And you think, well, what's the big deal? Well, you got to remember a couple of things. Number one, to be barren was a curse from God in the Old Testament, and that's the way it was viewed. If you did not produce a child, you were in scorn. Think of Samuel. Hannah had no children. It was a shame and a reproach. Elkanah had other children by his other wife, Peninnah, but Hannah was barren, and it was a reproach upon her. Of course, God had other things in mind in that story as well. She's barren. Not only that, she's queen, one of the queens, and the queen is not giving the king an heir to the throne. Also a shame. So this is a pretty big deal. God did not bless her with children because she looked down on the worship of David. And we got to be careful. We have to be oh so careful that we do not lift ourselves up in arrogance and look down on how other people praise and worship the Lord. We need to be oh so careful in that. So all that happens, 2 Samuel, then chapter 7, and we go through, David tells Nathan the prophet that he wants to build a house for God. And so God comes to Nathan and says, basically, David, you're a bloody man of war, and my house needs to be built by somebody who isn't. So you're not going to build it, but your son will build it. Let's look at that in verse 4 of chapter 7. Verse 4, it came to pass that night the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, go and tell thy servant David. Verse 6 says, I haven't dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. And by the way, I believe that same tabernacle was set up in Jerusalem, and that's where the ark was headed. I don't have time to get into the why, but I believe that God made that tabernacle last all the way into the reign of Solomon, and Solomon building the temple for the Lord in Jerusalem. But go down to verse, let me see here. verse 12. And this is where God gives a promise to David about his descendants, about his rulership. And when thy days shall be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. Wait a minute. Time's not going to last forever. At one point, the earth is going to cease to be, and time shall be no more. How can the house of David be established forever? Well, here you go back to the Christmas story in the New Testament, and you find that the eternal Son of God becomes a human race of the seed of David, and will one day rule in Jerusalem and in the New Jerusalem. And so the house of David indeed shall last forever, as God so wondrously promised David here way back in 2 Samuel. What a wonderful, wonderful thing. So God thanks and David thanks and praises God for his care and his provision and his promises in kind of a prayer / ode of honor all the way down through verse 29, therefore now let it please thee to bless the house of thy servant, that I may continue forever before thee. For thou, O Lord God, hast spoken it, and with thy blessing let the house of thy servant be blessed forever. And I'll not read the entire ode, because we will get into some other works of David here in this class. But basically, David desires to build a house for God, and God says, I can't. You're a man of war. My house needs to be pure, but I'll let your son do it. And by the way, not only is your son going to build a house for me, your throne will be established forever. And what a wonderful, wonderful promise that was. So we'll not turn to Psalm 62. This is not said that it is penned by David, although I believe it was. It says to the chief musician, but the chief musician at this point is not Asaph. It seems, if you go into Chronicles and see where David actually sets up the structure, and I didn't want to get into all that, that would have taken us forever to get through, but I am going to reference it here. When David sets up the structure of the musicianship and establishes the Levite priests in their orders that continues to the time of Christ. Remember, Zechariah was of the order of thus and such, and it was his turn to serve. All that was established clear back by David as he establishes the kingship of Israel and the way that he was going to worship the Lord and the way Israel would worship the Lord for generations. But Asaph is the one we commonly think of as the chief musician. But this is to Jeduthun. Jeduthun, there's a couple of ideas about why Jeduthun is called the chief musician. I really think, having studied it out, my initial thoughts were that Asaph had died or retired and Jeduthun took his place. But if you look at the ages, Jeduthun was older. And Asaph is clear into Solomon's time. So I think it's more likely that Jeduthun kind of helped with some of the initial works. David gets introduced to Asaph and is promoted to chief musician. I don't know the circumstances surrounding it, but when you look at the details, that seems to be the case. Jeduthun was a son of Levi, and so we're going to take a look at a couple of the charts that I have written out here. He was also known as Ethan the Ezrahite. He was known as Jeduthun the Merarite, and this is because Levi had three sons. You have the son of Abraham, or no, rather the son of Jacob, Israel. Levi had three sons: Gershon, Merari, and Kohath. All right. The Gershonites went 12 generations down and produced Asaph, who eventually becomes chief musician during David's reign, a chief musician of the tabernacle worship of the Lord. The Merari, we go down 11 generations, and we have Ethan, who is also Jeduthun. Now, this is important because Ethan's called the Ezrahite. The Merarites were the people when Israel took over the land. The Merarites were given the land of the town of Bethlehem, where the town of Bethlehem is located. Jeduthun came from Bethlehem. Guess who else came from Bethlehem? David. And I believe that these two knew one another beforehand. When David picks who he's going to have worship the Lord, he goes to the tribe of Levi, as God indicated should happen for tabernacle service of himself, that David went to people he knew and set up administration. Abner was Saul's cousin. Saul did the same thing. Joab, we find out, was also from Bethlehem. Kohath then, we get on 15 generations, and then we have Elkanah, the third. There are three Elkanahs in the lineage after Kohath. Kohath, 15 generations. Elkanah, the third, is the father of Samuel the prophet. The same Samuel that features in 1 Samuel, the Samuel the prophet. Samuel has a son named Joel, who has a son named Heman. Now Heman was known as a singer, and he is selected as a chief musician as well. So I think this is interesting that you have Asaph, you have Jeduthun, and you have Heman as the three selected in the worship system of the tabernacle at the time. David, we assume, has the tabernacle set up in Jerusalem or some similar structure with the Holy of Holies and a holy place in an outer court, which we'll get to some of. We're not going to get into the whole details of the tabernacle. That's not what's important here. But let me see here. Pardon me. Okay, so Jeduthun, or Ethan, became a great choral and orchestral leader in the worship services during King David's reign. Eventually, he was chief musician at the death of the retirement of Asaph. That's one explanation. Or he could have been the original one, and Asaph was promoted, which I actually think is more likely. He served at the door of the tabernacle, out here in the outer court. In fact, many of his sons became porters, people who carried pieces of the ark, pieces of equipment, and pieces of the structure of the tabernacle. He was part of that family. But he served at the door of the tabernacle as one of the music leaders. Heman was in the middle, with Asaph to Heman's left and Ethan to Heman's right. Jeduthun was a vocalist, a harpist, possibly a trumpeter and cymbalist, which was really used more for timekeeping than for sudden punctuated crashes. As a harpist, he was also the father and probably teacher of the family of stringed instrumentalists. Again, his son were the porters of the house of the Lord in perpetuity. As I said, Jeduthun was from the family of Merari, whose family was given the territory that Bethlehem, the hometown of David, was located in. They might have known each other. I mean, it really isn't a big place. Prior to these events, they might have even studied music together, or from one from the other. I don't know. I think that way. I think, man, could these people have learned music together or sang together even before David became king? I don't know. I have no idea. I have no way of knowing that. But the point is that David used people he was connected with when he set up his administration. One last detail: when we talked last time that David's two attempts to move the Ark of God, in between there, he stored the Ark in Gath at the house of Obed-Edom. Gath was also one of the territories assigned to the Merarites. And Obed-Edom was the son of Ethan, Jeduthun. So David knew him too. So David has an intimate connection with Jeduthun. He has an intimate connection with Heman. The only one we don't really have a solid connection for is Asaph. But evidently, and we don't have time to get into it, this isn't about Asaph, but Asaph excels and becomes chief musician. Obed-Edom was the son of Jeduthun. He was also a lyre player, the stringed kind, all right, not a fibber. But he's intimately connected with these folks. Heman was the grandson of Samuel, one of David's mentors. Asaph is called a brother to Heman, but I think that means brother in the sense of the same family, not necessarily an actual brother. They have different fathers. I did go through the genealogies and I looked, and so they're not actually brothers, as in from the same parentage. But two of these three who will factor in so much into the music system of the tabernacle have an intimate connection with David, and this is going to continue throughout David's reign, throughout his kingship, where he will use people that he knows and trusts in positions of authority. So David now begins an offensive military campaign, and we see some of the results from that. If you look over in 2 Samuel chapter 8, and after this it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Methgammah out of the hand of the Philistines, and he smote Moab, and measured them with a line, casting them down to the ground, even with 2 lines measured he to put to death, and with 1 full line to keep alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. So David attacks and suppresses the Philistine nation. He captures Methgammah, which is just another name for Gath. It's the same place that Goliath was from. Like I said, this city remains significant in David's life throughout his life. He attacks Moab. He enslaves the remaining Moabites. He recaptures the territory of Israel all the way to the Euphrates River. He kills Hadadezer, king of Zobah, which was a chief city of Syria at the river. David receives massive spoils of war at that conquest. He gets 1,000 chariots. He maims all the horses except enough to pull 100 of those chariots. He gets 700 horsemen and 20,000 footmen. The Syrians were from Damascus were trying to come to Hadadezer's rescue. David kills 22,000 of their lot and occupies Damascus and enslaves the Syrians. So God is just granting David victory. He's enlarging the borders of Israel, and a lot of things are going on real well. He takes shields of gold from Hadadezer's army and brings them back to Jerusalem, and he plunders Hadadezer's cities of Betah and Berotai, and brings back great quantities of brass. And then an unexpected gift comes into the hand of David. Verse 9 of chapter 8 says, When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had smitten all the host of Hadadezer, then Toi sent Joram his son unto King David to salute him and to bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and smitten him, for Hadadezer had wars with Toi. And Joram brought with him vessels of silver and vessels of gold and vessels of brass, which also King David did dedicate unto the Lord, with the silver and gold he had dedicated of all nations which he had subdued, of Syria and of Moab and of the children of Ammon and of the Philistines and of Amalek, and of the spoil of Hadadezer son of Rahab, king of Zobah. David gat him a name when he returned from smiting the Syrians in the valley of Salt, being 18,000 men. So he gives him just gifts. Thank you for taking care of my enemy for me. Prince Joram brings these gifts to David. He dedicates them to the Lord along with the plunder from the other nations. And David is now gaining himself a reputation, according to verse 13. When he returned from smiting the Syrians in the valley of Salt, especially subduing the armies of Syria with only 18,000 men. So David occupies Edom. He subjugates the Edomites in verse 14. And David sets up his cabinet. And this is how his heads of state, and it's kind of wordy through the scriptures. So I've kind of boiled it down for you as to who David's heads of state are at this point in his kingship. All right, well, there's David, king of Israel. Then there's Joab, captain of the army. There's Jehoshaphat, royal recorder. There's Zadok the priest, Ahimelech the priest, Seraiah, the royal scribe, Benaiah, captain of the royal guard and overseer of the royal messengers. And then David's sons became acting priests, probably some sort of mediatory position to help with the day-to-day court activities. I'm guessing it's really more some kind of a lower judge. David was not from the tribe of Levi, so he would not. He was the tribe of Judah, so he would not have had rights. His sons would not have had rights as priestly duties, but maybe as assistants to the priests to carry about through some of the more mundane day-to-day activities for them. So at this point, it is at this point that David writes Psalm 60, and we will turn to Psalm 60. He comes back from the valley of Salt and destroys the Syrians with only 18,000 men. When he gets back, at some point after his return, he pens Psalm 60. So we'll take a look at that here as soon as I can get there. All right, so we have another title to the chief musician upon Shushaniduth, Mikdam of David, to teach when he strove with Aram Naharaim and with Aram Zobah, when Joab returned and smote of Edom in the valley of Salt 12,000. So we have Shushaniduth, which could be a tune, a popular tune of the day, but I think it's more likely that it is accompanied by trumpets. This is Mikdam of David. Mikdam means to teach. It's a teaching tool. It may further cement the idea of importance and a requirement of use. The psalm, again, dated by an event when David fought against Aram Naharaim and Aram Zobah, when Joab returned from slaying 12,000 in the Valley of Salt. So the psalm is divided up into two distinct systems of 4 verses each, with a coda of 4 verses. So let's look at the first 4 verses of Psalm 60. O God, thou hast cast us off. Thou hast scattered us. Thou hast been displeased. O turn thyself to us again. Thou hast made the earth to tremble. Thou hast broken it. Thou heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh. Thou hast showed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it may be displayed because of thy truth. Selah. God's in control. And he closes the system with a Selah, which probably has an instrumental interlude here, because we are about to turn over the tone of this psalm, which is very, very common in Near Eastern literature, Near Eastern poetry, to do things just for the sake of contrast and comparison. Parallelism is the name of it. So verse 5, we see is the second system, that thy beloved may be delivered, save with thy right hand and hear me. God hath spoken his holiness. I will rejoice. I will divide Shechem, and mete out the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, and Manasseh is mine. Ephraim also is the strength of mine head. Judah is my lawgiver. Moab is my washpot. Over Edom will I cast out my shoe. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. Who will bring me into strong city? I'm sorry, verse 8 is where we stop. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. So God in his omnipotence destroys his enemies, delivers his people, and then we see in the coda that David is going to request some help. Verse 9, who will bring me into the strong city? Who will lead me into Edom? Wilt not thou, O God, which hadst cast us off, and thou, O God, which didst not go out with our armies, give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. Through God we shall do valiantly, for he it is that doth tread down our enemies. So I think it's important to remember, again, David has no foreknowledge of the end from the beginning and how things are going to turn out. From the tone of this particular psalm, it seems it was written during the battle in some way. But again, it's a mikdam. So during the battle, we were having these difficulties. We weren't sure we were going to win. God grants the victories, destroys our enemies, and then there's the request for God to deliver them out of all their trouble. So that is Psalm 60, and it's written around the time of the battle over the Valley of Salt. Now we are going to look next time at David extending more kindness to the house of Saul. And this is just something his enemies never see. Let me say something. When you extend grace, people will never understand. They will never understand why a wife would take back an estranged husband. They'll never understand why a broken friendship will be restored. They'll never understand why David would reach out in kindness to the house of Saul. And it was misjudged. David's motives were misjudged. David's actions were misjudged. David's reactions were continually misjudged by people in his life because he simply had grace and humility before the house of Saul. And now, as king, as a victorious king with rulership over all Israel, we see he is going to publicly display before everybody kindness to the house of Saul. So we'll look at that next time, some more battles and whatnot during David's reign, and so we'll see how David fares as king of all Israel.